we're going to talk about our theories related to intelligence. The first individual we're going to talk about is Garofalo, who was from the Italian school, the same Italian school that we saw in the theories related to physical appearance. Garofalo argued that criminals were deficient in moral sensibilities or intelligence. He actually believed that criminals were not able to live by the basic human sentiments necessary for the survival of society. He thought that people with moral anomalies could not be held responsible for their actions, and that actually committing crime was beyond their control. Therefore, society needed protection from them. He actually used Darwin's theory of natural selection or survival of the fittest to justify the elimination of criminals. He said that we needed to rid society of its maladaptive elements. And the way that he proposed that we eliminate the criminals was transportation for the lesser criminals, think Australia or Georgia. And then he also advocated for execution of more serious criminals. Now, although their ideas of what caused crime was largely rejected, the legacy of this Italian school is the introduction and development of positivism in all criminology. The next theorist that talked about intelligence was Binet. And Binet actually developed intelligence tests. He did so to identify children who did poorly in school so that they could be given special help. He did not think that these kids were unreachable, but he thought that their school performance could be improved. So he thought that intelligence was biologically given, but it was not fixed. He thought that it could be changed or improved through training and education. So he did not intend for his IQ test to be used to identify those of superior intelligence, and he actually warned that his test was not designed for that purpose. Although Mr. Binet's test was not designed for this purpose, Americans thought that intelligence was biological and fixed, and so they wanted to use his IQ test to sort people into their appropriate social roles. In particular, they wanted to identify people who were below normal so that they could prevent them from reproducing and passing on low IQ to their children. The next we have Goddard. And Goddard developed his own intelligence test, and he believed that people who scored between the mental ages of 8 and 12 on his intelligence scale should be classified as feeble-minded, morons, or high-grade defectives. He argued that these people presented a potential danger because he said that where they could be trained to function in society, their stupidity would likely get them in trouble. So he determined that most criminals were feeble-minded. And he concluded that feeble-mindedness was hereditary, and therefore the best way to prevent both feeble-mindedness and crime was to prevent feeble-minded people from reproducing. So he believed that criminality and feeble-mindedness came from the same biological or genetic inferiority, and that all feeble-minded people were potentially criminals. So feeble-mindedness, and hence crime, could be eliminated through selective breeding. So he advocated for the testing of people. And through testing, he found that a large proportion of both criminals and immigrants were feeble-minded. However, eventually the Army allowed testing of World War I draftees and found that a large number of them were also feeble-minded. Eventually it was determined that about half of the U.S. population was feeble-minded, and that incarcerated criminals had higher than average IQs than World War I draftees, and so therefore this led people to reject the validity of his scale. Now there is some very negative consequences that stemmed from Goddard's work. Unfortunately, many of the immigrants, because remember he tested both immigrants and criminals, many of the immigrants, including though many Jewish refugees who were trying to escape from the Holocaust, were actually denied entrance into the United States because they were deemed to be feeble-minded. Additionally, compulsory sterilization, which means that individuals who were deemed feeble-minded were no longer allowed to have children. So women, that meant a hysterectomy. Men, that meant they were castrated. So compulsory sterilization was practiced in up to 30 states until the 1970s. It is estimated that over 64,000 people were forcibly sterilized. This impact and this idea that criminals had lower intelligence than non-criminals actually fell out of favor for a long time after Goddard's research was rejected. But in the late 1970s, the idea that there was a relationship between IQ and crime was actually resurrected. So that's where we see Hershey and Hindelang. They wrote their theory in 1977. And they said that low intelligence is a significant factor of crime, although they believed that its effect was actually indirect. So what their theory states is that children who are or have low intelligence are not as prepared for school. So they are less likely to succeed in school, less likely to receive academic rewards, and to develop positive attachments. They're also increased or more likely to have negative school experiences. And one of the outcomes of this failure in school, according to Hershey and Hindelang, is delinquency. So as you see in the figure, low IQ leads to poor school performance, which possibly leads to delinquency. Now, subsequent research has failed to find a relationship between IQ and crime. However, despite this, low IQ is still used by some to explain crime, even as recent as 1991. Herrnstein and Murray wrote a book called The Bell Curve. Now, they have a unique slant on IQ, the IQ and crime relationship. They believed that IQ is one genetic link in the causation of crime. But what they looked at, the one step further, is they looked at racial differences in IQ and believed that the racial differences reflected an innate genetic difference between the races, and it was not a social difference. Now, African Americans typically score an average of 14 points lower on IQ tests than whites. What Herrnstein and Murray argue is that low IQ scores could not be changed, and so IQ will change little throughout an individual's lifetime, regardless of their social or educational intervention, and that low IQ directly leads to crime because low IQ is associated with a diminished capacity for moral reasoning or the diminished ability to know right from wrong. So they state that the differences in crime rates between races can be accounted for by the differences in IQ. This theory was greatly criticized, and actually the American Psychological Association composed a task force that concluded that their findings were wrong. So there are many problems with the theories of IQ. Some of them specifically are that the idea that IQ is hereditary is false. Intelligence may actually have a genetic component, but IQ, which is what IQ tests measure, does not have a genetic component. The next is that IQ tests measure innate intelligence. This idea is false. IQ tests do seem to measure or to be good measures of the ability to do well in school, and experts agree that IQ tests are actually a better measure of a person's background learning environment more so than their natural intelligence. So IQ tests do not equal intelligence. There is evidence that children who are delinquent have lower IQs, but this does not necessarily mean that they are less intelligent. Also, the idea that different racial groups have different levels of innate intelligence is false. Experts agree that IQ tests are actually culturally specific. In particular, they measure similarity with white middle-class language patterns and experiences. So racial differences in IQ scores likely reflect cultural or social or educational differences and not differences in innate intelligence. Low IQ may actually be associated with crime and delinquent behavior, but research fails to show that it actually causes criminal behavior. Also, any observed relationship between IQ and crime does not indicate a relationship between intelligence and crime, because IQ tests measure something other than innate intelligence.